As you'd be well aware, not a day seems to go by when we don't talk about China in one respect or another, whether it's the trade war between China and the United States, whether it's what's going on in Hong Kong, whether it is indeed issues about attempts and alleged Chinese interference in Australia. Well, today, or in fact tonight, the Centre Alliance Senator Rex Patrick had been hoping to establish a parliamentary inquiry into Australia's relationship with China so that a lot of this could be more openly discussed. But he's had some bad news on that front. Senator Patrick joins me now. Thanks for your time.
You're welcome.
So what's the go here? The major parties are both saying they don't want an inquiry? Neither
party wants to have an inquiry into China. It would seem they are fearful of consequence, which just shows, in fact, why we perhaps should have such an inquiry. There's some soft power being exercised on the Australian Parliament.
You think they're being heavied by Beijing?
I think they are fearful of consequences if they were to hold an inquiry. I mean, as you mentioned in your opening, China is being talked about all of the time, whether it be in relation to the trade war between the United States and China, which will affect us, the South China Sea plans of China, and expansion into the Pacific. What's happening in Hong Kong, Confucius Institute issues here in Australia, foreign interference. We have the port of Darwin being bought by the Chinese company Land.
So what did you have in mind here to have an inquiry where you could call intelligence bosses, some of the academics at these Confucius Institutes? What was your plan?
I wanted to have a wide-ranging inquiry that looked at all aspects of the relationship, and that includes the really good bits and the things that we need to be cautious about. So I wanted to look at trade, I wanted to look at security-related aspects, how we look at consular relations between the two countries. We know, of course, right now we've got Dr. Yang imprisoned on charges of espionage, and really just want to look at how we deal with China moving into the future. For the last 200 years, we have always had a situation where either the UK or the US was our major trading partner and indeed our major security partner. That has changed. There's no question that China is our largest trading partner now, and this is not going to reverse, and we need to look responsibly at that relationship, examine it, work out how we can do better in that relationship, and as I said, what we need to be cautious about.
I thought you did have Labor's Kimberley Kitching on board with you for this.
Well, I did try and raise a motion in the Senate last year for an inquiry after the Victorian government signed a secret deal with the Chinese, and of course my concern is that foreign relations is a federal responsibility. At that time, both Labor and Liberals refused to support an inquiry. So I was working away in background on some alternate terms of reference, just letting the heat die down from that moment. And then the Defence, Foreign Affairs and Trades Committee indicated that they would like to run an inquiry into China. I was approached by the Secretariat just to have a look at my terms of reference, which were then adopted, and a motion was moved by the chair of that committee, Senator Kimberley Kitching, to have an inquiry. It was lodged, but quickly I received a phone call saying, sorry, we can't go ahead. I left my name on the motion because I had agreed to co-sponsor it, and then postponed it until today.
So she's been overruled?
I'm guessing that she has been overruled.
So what then do you say to those in both major parties who often express concerns about China, about what's going on with Yang Hengjun or what's going on in the South China Sea or the Pacific and so on, who are being silent now?
Well, people are not being silent outside of the Parliament. The issue is that the Parliament, which is a separate arm to government, I understand governments might be sensitive about these things, but the Parliament is a separate structure under our Constitution with rights to look at these sorts of issues. Back in 2005, 2006, the same committee ran an inquiry into China. They've looked at other countries as well. It's quite normal for the Defence, Foreign Affairs and Trade Committee to look at different countries.
One of our major relationships.
Yeah, and this is a big relationship. It's a really important relationship. And we can't just stick our head in the sand and pretend that things haven't changed and that, that we don't need to think strategically about how we manage that relationship.
Let me go to a couple of other pieces of legislation that you'll be dealing with in this sitting. Jackie Lambie yesterday indicated support for drug testing welfare recipients. Today she's not. That would leave the ball in your court, I suppose. Where do you stand on this idea?
Well, I think she might have been misconstrued in that she said she wouldn't support it until politicians were drug tested. And
I think she's saying also,
yeah, I think she's
make sure the supports are there for rehabilitation.
She's clarified that. Our position is quite simple. Firstly, we haven't been presented with any piece of legislation, so it's really hard to comment on anything that we haven't seen.
It did come up in the last parliament.
It did come up in the last parliament, and we didn't support it in the last parliament for a couple of reasons. One of them is the evidence from overseas suggests that it doesn't work, and secondly, it's our view that you can't simply just drug test somebody and then cast them aside. You actually have to have proper support facilities to help people who have found themselves...
So if they beefed that up, if they had more support for drug users on welfare, might that get you over the line?
Well, the difficulty is that there are no support services now for people who stick their hand up and say, I want to be helped. So part of our issue last time around was we asked for what other support would come with this and what would the cost be, and we were never provided with that information.
So you'd want to see a lot more on the table?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're sort of in the dark, and it's not appropriate really for us to suggest whether we would or wouldn't. At this point in time, things haven't changed since we didn't support it in the 45th Parliament.
The rollout or the extension of the cashless welfare card trial, the trials are underway in a few places right now. Is it time to expand these trials?
Well, we gave support to trials in a number of areas, and indeed in exchange for our support for an extension of the timeframes and for an additional site, we agreed with the government that they had to re-baseline the data that hadn't been properly baselined when the initial trial started.
Right.
Once again, we want to look at this from an evidence-based perspective, and what happened was they have collected that baseline data, but the universities in South Australia are now looking at that data. They haven't completed their report.
So until that work's done, this is the independent assessment, until that work's done by the, as you say, the University of Adelaide personnel, you're not going to back it, an extension?
Well, in some sense, that was the agreement we had with the government. We said we would support a trial, a properly run trial, and then let us see the data and then have a conversation with us. For some reason, whatever it may be, they've decided to proceed ahead of receiving the analysis.
The bill to deregister unions and union officials, you've proposed an amendment to this that would remove the power of the minister to actually refer a rogue union official. Where's that at? Have you reached agreement with the government on that?
No, so I have sat down and had a conversation with Christian Porter, the Attorney-General, and I've talked about areas of concern, one being a minister initiating an action, because certainly in the commercial world that doesn't happen in the, for corporations. I've also talked about concerns in relation to overseas convictions being used in the context of deregistering an official, noting that there are some jurisdictions where things like homosexuality are unlawful, and that, of course, is not appropriate.
So is Christian Porter going to move on these things?
Well, I think he will. So a couple of other things I've raised in terms of what needs to be looked at. We need parity between the way in which unions are dealt with in terms of misconduct and corporations. But we also don't want to have a situation when as we construct something to deal with the misconduct by unions like the CFMMEU, we don't disrupt the very good work that unions do right across this country supporting workers.
You'd be worried that if a union was deregistered, some workers doing nothing wrong would be left high and dry? Well,
I don't want to see unions prevented from doing the good work that they do. In fact, it would, in some sense, be disastrous if some of these people were to fall outside a responsible union's umbrella, because they may then end up being more rogue than perhaps they might have been otherwise.
Okay, so to be clear, you're still in talks with Christian Porter?
We're in discussions, and there are hearings taking place starting this Thursday night and indeed Friday in Brisbane, where, through the normal Senate processes, we will hear from everyone, and at some later stage I will sit down and talk in detail with Christian Porter as to what would need to be done to get Centre Alliance across the line.
And the mandatory sentencing of pedophiles, where are you at on that?
Well, our view is that a custodial sentence for people who interfere with children sexually is probably appropriate. However, we haven't, again, seen the legislation. We don't know what offences that might apply to, whether or not perhaps a strengthening of some of the terms would in fact do a better job. So we once again want to see the detail, but we're sympathetic to the view that people who interfere with children should not be allowed to walk away from the courtroom without some form of custodial sentence.
Can I just ask you, how's generally negotiating with this government going right now compared to, I guess, the previous parliament? We're a few months on now from the election. It sounds like you're wanting to see a bit of detail on these bills that they're bowling up.
Well, that's always been the way that we've worked, and in some sense we're in a more critical position now because there are fewer crossbenchers, and it sometimes or often comes down to just us. And we like to look through legislation, make proper decisions, not political decisions, but look at law to make sure it's not bad law or to make sure it's appropriately constructed to deal with a particular
But is the government consulting you as much as you'd like?
Yes, they do. They know that in order to get some legislation through the Senate, they have to talk to us, and they do engage us early. They do have discussions. We've got a pretty good working relationship with the government. Now, that doesn't mean we'll always say yes to them. We sit down and talk, go through the things that concern us, and if we can reach an arrangement whereby they're comfortable and we're comfortable, then we agree and we'll support them in the Senate.
All right. Centre Alliance Senator Rex Patrick, thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. Appreciate it.
Thank you.